not a whole lot happened until until the deal Vietnam joined the ASEAN. And then they had more of a real free trade agreement. More countries were able to actually invest and actually start to enter the market more openly. And then when it hit to 2007, joining the WTO, and then basically Vietnam became quite serious about really entering the international market. And then more recently, the big thing has been in the last year or two has been the free trade agreement with Europe. This is a kind of a major game changer because it's moving a lot of companies in Europe away from China and more into Vietnam. And then I kind of wanted to talk about, some of the things that have actually shifted production and shifted the looking at Vietnam. One of the original things was actually with SARS in 2003, and Alpha SARS. They say that they came up with the China plus one strategy, mostly because of like Japanese companies that were heavily invested in China. They had major issues because they were being heavily invested in China, and they didn't have any alternatives for their suppliers when SARS broke out. So after that, especially the Japanese and then the Koreans and other people, other countries in Asia started to really look more seriously at alternatives. And as things opened up, of course, that changed the situation. But really, I never noticed anything that much at the beginning. I ended up in China in 2005. In 2005, China was still the place to be. I was before that, I spent 9 years in Mexico. Mexico at the beginning was doing really well, and towards the end, Mexico was still doing quite well. But the biggest issue was that at the end of my time in Mexico, what started to happen is a lot of the electronics started to leave Mexico into China. A lot of the furniture manufacturing started leaving Mexico into China. A lot of stuff started to move, and that's what actually made me decide to go back and do my MBA. And I went to Thunderbird with the basically the whole intention that after I finish up my MBA, I'm going to change regions from Latin America to Asia. So that was kind of a big deal. But then I ended up in China in 2005. At that time, all the companies, especially the big companies, were really entering China, really aggressive at going into China. But it wasn't until around 2010 and 2015 that the big companies started to really look at leaving China. And I would say that probably the last 5 years of my time in China, most of the companies that I dealt with, their main objective is we need an alternative to China. We have to balance this out. We're too focused here. The prices of things are going up. And actually the biggest one became also that a lot of companies entered China saying that, oh, there's 1 billion people here and we're going to be able to sell to 1 billion Chinese. But a lot of companies after 10 years, they realize it's not possible. You're not allowed. So if you're not allowed, then that kind of breaks your biggest reason for being in China. And then a lot of people started going and looking at other markets. I had many of my clients in China that basically they cut all investment in China very quietly. They never said anything public. They never said anything about what they were going to do. And they quietly started leaving China. And they started going into Vietnam, and they started to go into Thailand and Indonesia and Malaysia and Philippines and whatever they thought was the right place for them. And it really depended on what their industry was. But that was 5 years ago. And then the trade war started in 2018. The trade war, I remember when it first started, a lot of my friends and a lot of clients and a lot of people that would always ask me, oh, how is this for China? And it's like, at that point, I'd already spent basically 3 years helping companies do nothing but leave China. So the only thing that really started to happen at that point is with the trade war, a lot of medium-sized companies and a lot of smaller companies started looking out and started getting much more serious about leaving China, or not maybe leaving China, but at least having alternatives. Because especially large companies, they might have a global footprint for their manufacturing, that they have several plants in several different regions. They have no issues. They can go wherever. And if they need to switch regions, they can send their tooling. It's very painful, very expensive, but they can do it because they have alternatives. But a lot of small companies, they have one factory, they have one supplier that can do that item. And so, but once the trade war started, they had no choice. They had to do and look for alternatives and have some way to balance their risk. So then at that time, some companies did start going to Vietnam, and Vietnam was a big success for a while. And then, as COVID started at the end of 2000, at the beginning of 2000, basically president was changing. They thought the political situation changed. No one knew what was going to happen with the trade war. Is it going to end? Is it going to continue? Are there tariffs going to increase? So all of this unpredictability has also really increased companies' willingness to have alternatives and have things ready to look at, what's the next phase. And then this right now is the next big thing. After, SARS was a big disruptor, and then now COVID-19 is another bigger disruptor. And the main thing that it's done is, in the past, companies, especially medium-sized companies, would look at things and they say, they would really focus on price, and they would really just focus on, no worries, nothing's going to go wrong. We can have, things delivered, just in time, basically, and sell to our customers and everything, no big deal. But actually, COVID has really taught a lot of companies that you need some risk mitigation in your sourcing. You need some alternatives. You need backup plans for when things go wrong. And this right now, it doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon. One of the things that Vietnam has been doing very successfully over the years, and probably one of the, I feel is probably the most aggressive in Asia, is developing their free trade agreements. They have 16 different free trade agreements. They can basically trade with whoever they want. And you can generally find some way to use a free trade agreement to get into your market, or to do part of your production in another market, or supply components to a different market, which was quite nice. Especially looking back in things like Mexico. Like Mexico is quite weak now in electronics, but Vietnam is coming up very hard in electronics. So that kind of synergy for small electronics that cost nothing to ship, but they cost a lot to ship now, but you can ship them by air and it's not a big deal. So these free trade agreements have really opened up the market, and I've had clients that were always looking at different places in Asia. People will say, they're looking at Philippines, they're looking at Vietnam, they're looking at Thailand, they're looking at Cambodia, they're looking at Myanmar. And one of the biggest things that has gotten a lot of my clients to choose Vietnam is because of these free trade agreements. Because they say, well, if we set up in this other country, we have all these tariffs and we have all these trouble to try to export to other countries. But if we set up our production in Vietnam, then now we can export to basically everywhere in Asia, and plus a lot of other places, to supply components to our other factories or other suppliers or wherever we need. So this has actually been something that drove a lot of business to Vietnam. And one of the big things that they say is, basically within these free trade agreements, you got 68% of the world population, and you have 78% of the world's GDP, which is a crazy amount of exposure for such a small country. It is nowhere near the size of China. It's China's 1.4 billion ish, and basically Vietnam's 100 million people. And the other thing that's got a lot of my clients to look at Vietnam is, okay, of course, the repeating the access to basically the half of the world's population is very close. So you can basically ship your goods to half the world's population within 5 days. Well, that's during normal times. Right now, 5 days is very, very, very fast. And you're probably paying crazy rates for air shipment if you can get it on the airplane. So, and then the other one is, the normal of 5 hours flying time. Well, during normal times, it wasn't a big deal. People could be based out of Vietnam, and you could go visit suppliers in China. Or I mean, actually, for me, during my time in China, I did many projects in Vietnam, but I was based in Shanghai. So what did it mean? It meant, okay, I get on a plane on Monday, I fly down to Vietnam, I spend the week or half the week, go visit, 5 or 10 factories, do evaluations and negotiations, fix some quality control problem, and then I fly back to Shanghai, and it's no big deal. Right now, it's a complete nightmare because that would take you, months to do. So, that's one of the things that's, got me, I have business in Vietnam and I have business in China. But of course, for me, returning to China, if I return to China, I maybe cannot return to Vietnam, or if I can, it's going to be super expensive and it's going to be super difficult. And, I've had friends that, have gone into quarantine when it was 2 weeks and they got stuck there for a month. And then they get a home quarantine for another couple weeks or whatever. So you can't really predict it. And if you need to go visit factories, it's really, really, impossible to take that risk. So basically for the last year, I've been here in Vietnam. And, one of the things, I guess, Vietnam has a lot of industrial parks. A lot of the industrial parks are not as mature as they are in China. China has had, a 20-year, 15-year head start on Vietnam. They've had lots of engineers sent over from Europe, lots of engineers sent over from the US, a lot of engineers sent over from Japan and Korea and everywhere else, developing their factories, implementing quality control processes, setting up the equipment correctly. And then now a lot of companies in China are very, very capable, and they're very capable of doing things, especially if it's standard work or it's not too far out of the ordinary. They're able to do it with you, and you can go to get a turnkey solution. That is very different in Vietnam. Vietnam, it's less mature. You're going to have to do a lot more work. You're going to have to consider that it's like investing. You're going to have to invest in your supplier to do some development. Most of my clients, they look at it and they think it's going to be like China, and it's always a big thing to explain to them. It's not like China. It's like China was 15 years ago when I first arrived in China. That you had to hold the hands of the factories a lot. And of course, especially at that time, mostly I wasn't dealing with the highest end factories. I was dealing, because the highest end factories, they're already getting a bit mature, so they didn't need assistance. But a lot of the medium-sized factories and the newer factories, they needed a lot of help and they needed a lot of hand holding. So I would help them. Within Vietnam, there's some big things about how the regions go. There is a lot of stuff in the north. In the north is Hanoi. It's the government center. So what you'll find in the north is basically a lot of factories that require a lot of capital investment. So these are basically companies that have got some help as kind of state-run companies, or they've got connections to the government so they can get funds. So if you're doing a big country-to-country deal, a lot of times this is the place to source. If you're looking at you want to bring in a very capital-intensive industry or a very capital-intensive factory, and you need something, an access to capital. You want the Vietnamese government to help you with something. more than likely they're going to push you to do that towards the north and towards basically Hanoi, towards the government center, so you can deal with the government. And then now in the center of the country, you have a lot of stuff around oil and gas, petrochemicals, shipbuilding, things in that area, and that is just starting to really develop, especially with the oil and gas. They're really putting a lot of FDI into that right now.
Container building too, Jacob.
Yeah, a bit. I'm not sure where they're gonna put in the new center. There's one of the steel factories, but they have factories all over. So I haven't been able to figure out where they're actually going to build them, but they're going to start building containers in the beginning of next year. Yeah. Which is going to be, well, at the beginning I thought, okay, well, whatever. By that time, it's going to be a waste because there's no real need for these containers. They'll figure it out and make it work out. But now it seems like, okay, it won't relieve the congestion so much. It won't relieve things so much, but it will help. And it's something for Vietnam to do with the steel that they have here. It's an industry that's pretty standard, heavy construction. It's got some government help to do that kind of thing. So I'm sure they're going to be able to support and be able to produce containers for local consumption and local use to be able to export abroad. And as Vietnam really improves their infrastructure and improves their shipping, having that locally and actually being able to do the repair better, maybe because if they're starting to do the production of the containers, they're probably going to improve their efficiency and their facilities for actually repairing the containers and reconditioning the containers, which will probably also give them a little bit of advantage and help in the future. And then down here in the south, where I'm at, Ho Chi Minh City, there's all kinds of industries. Basically, if you need flexibility out of a company, you basically come down here to the south. If I'm working with a small company or a medium-sized company, a lot of times I look at them and I say, well, what you're doing, logically, you'd look at things and you'd say to do it in the north because a lot of the suppliers or your customers are up in the north. But the difficulty, especially when you're a medium-sized company and you don't have the ear of government, it's really difficult for you. So it's much easier sometimes for these companies to say, okay, I'll set up a small factory in Ho Chi Minh City or near Ho Chi Minh City, where the government will be much more flexible with me, will be much more helpful to me, and won't interfere much with my business. And they'll let me do whatever I need to do to take care of my customers. And then I just have to worry about the transportation. Under normal circumstances, it's not really much of a big deal. Right now, some of these things, it's really killing companies, because now if you're sending a truck from the south to the north, now you have to have your drivers tested every province or every few provinces, or you can't get out to the port to take it out by sea and back into Haiphong or anything like that. So it's quite a nightmare now. But in general, for small companies, I often recommend them to just go down to the south and make your production and make your manufacturing simpler, and then just deal with the logistics of sending it up to your customer, rather than the day-to-day of dealing with the government being much more into your business and what you're doing. So it's a lot of things about what companies want to do and the flexibility of what they need. Down here in the south, we have a lot of the textile manufacturers. They can do anything from huge production lots to small stuff. They have all the Nike, Adidas, all the shoe factories are basically down in this area. And then there's just lots of just random stuff here, and especially for smaller companies. And you'll find a lot of European companies that have set up a manufacturing facility here. And that kind of gets down to, when you're looking at factories here, you'll have a local factory that isn't very mature at all. You'll have some mid-sized local factories that have some international experience, and they're kind of somewhere in the middle. And then you'll have quite a few international factories too that are down here. That you walk into the factory and you would think that you're in a factory in the US, or you think you're in a factory in Europe or whatever, because the machines are the same, the quality standards are the same, the production processes are the same. The only thing that you might notice is they might cut costs on some of their automation, maybe some of their packaging equipment. They say, well, we can do it manually rather than investing in a machine that's, $250,000 or $500,000 to do that. So that will, show you some things that they've decided to do manually. But a lot of the more mature European and American and Japanese and Korean factories here, they run at an international standard. But the thing is also, they kind of run at an international price. Not all the time. It's very frequent that you can deal with some of these companies and you think that the price is going to be ridiculous. And maybe it's a little bit higher than what you could get if you're trying to go for the absolute cheapest. But also, the amount of money that you're going to spend on supplier development and other things to monitor and do QC and everything else, sometimes it's worth it, just about to avoid the risk of things going wrong. And okay.
Oliver, you raised your hand. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah. Just a question, because I'm really curious how shipment risk, shipment pricing, and timeliness within Vietnam and also international shipments of, let's say, raw materials, how do they differ from neighboring countries? Is it very advanced already at this time because they have a huge coastline, of course, helping them?
Yeah, well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Right now, everything's a mess.
Everywhere it's a mess now. That's not just Vietnam.
So in general, there's some very good systems of transportation. Like right now, one of the big things that China is really helping Vietnam with, and they're helping with it because they think that basically China no longer has the young population to work in the assembly factories like they did before, and people aren't willing to take those jobs as much as before. But now there's basically you can go from the top of you can go from southern China and Shenzhen area, and you can get to Haiphong area in basically 12 hours. You can tend a truck, so you have electronics equipment, you have components, PVC, different electronic components, basically stuff that they need like hand assembly. So right now, that stuff is still being produced in China. Of course, for a long time, the electronic center has been in that Shenzhen type area in the south of China. And then, now that you're looking at it, it's a 12-hour trip between the two. A lot of people are saying, oh, this is great. That's why a lot of the electronics assembly work is coming into that area. China thinks it's going to stay that way, but it doesn't really make sense because, if you have this type of manufacturing equipment, if you have that equipment set up in Shenzhen, shipping the equipment, recertifying it, getting it set up in a factory in Vietnam, really not that big a difference. And then you have a half an hour delivery to your supplier or to your customer. And then you have much more of a just-in-time delivery and everything else, because, especially right now, people are worried. Under normal circumstances, when it's 12 hours, basically they would basically book their shipment, and every night they would have the shipment coming in for the production for the next day. Now, no one would ever take that risk, because you try to do that shipment and something goes wrong. There's an outbreak. Maybe they're not letting the trucks through. Maybe the driver tested positive. And now you have no way to get your parts, and then your factory is going to get shut down. So, that just-in-time thing is not really working so much anymore. And that's, that's kind of the basic of the shipping. If you want things to get down to Hanoi, it's a little bit more difficult. You might want to ship it by water, but right now the ports are a mess. Right now, because a lot of the factories now, especially in the South, have stopped working, or they're working with just a very, very, very basic skeleton crew. And because they're working with a very basic skeleton crew, of course, they don't have the resources to go pick up their containers that are coming in. They're not so worried about the inventory coming in because they're working at 20% of normal. So they're not running out of anything. So now what's happened recently, I've seen a lot of the ports that basically because the companies weren't picking up things. So basically they're shipping them to other cross transportation areas to send it at least away from the port, because the port was full. They couldn't take any more containers in. And, they thought, at the beginning, oh, okay, we're going to have a minor lockdown for a week, no big deal. But now it's been going for a month. And it's getting harder and harder for people to deal with.
Okay. And what about, just a quick question, north to south infrastructure development? Is that a major thing coming the coming years? Is that coming from the
I mean, they're
government as well?
trying a lot for train systems. They're trying a lot better for water. They're trying a lot better to develop the ports to make it easier. They're of course investing in the highways, and there's a lot of this stuff. And I've seen a lot of FDI in this area. I have different friends that are kind of in FDI type companies, and they're raising money for highways and expressways and bridges and trains and all kinds of stuff. But the thing is it's still a far ways away. Companies are, there's still a lot of investment needed into the logistics, into the infrastructure, because it's just Vietnam is behind. It hasn't put the money in necessary. And it hasn't had so much access to the international capital until more recent days.
Yeah, I just shared with the class last week, Jacob, last year, Vietnam, along with Mexico and Indonesia, all three of them got about 29 billion of FDI, about 1/5 of China's FDI. So just crazy what's going on with the FDI going in there. Let's open up to more people with questions. Let's make this interactive.
Sorry, I have a question. Okay, so basically, there's a lot of problems, and also after the COVID, right? There's a lot of problems, and it's a bit complicated when it comes to logistic. Is there any a spike up in the cost of logistic after the COVID?
It's crazy. We go from $3,000 a container to $15,000 a container. I mean, this is the biggest thing that's an issue for me right now. Actually, right now I'm working on projects in Mexico, because I had a project going, and I'm like, before I could talk to clients and say, hey, the price of logistics, it's a bit ridiculous. Maybe it won't go back 100% to what it was before, but it's going to go back to somewhat near normal. Maybe it's going to take us 6 months to get set up. By the 6 months, maybe you're going to do some test productions, and you're going to do some small shipments, and you're going to have to pay a bit of a crazy rate for that, but no big deal. By the time it's done, you'll be able to ship, and it won't kill you. But right now, when I talk to a lot of companies, it really depends on their product. I mean, a lot of times it's just not even worth their time to ship the goods when it's $15,000 a container. It just doesn't make sense. And, I think that's going to change a lot of things. And I think this right now it's a big push for Christmas orders. So, I think the idea of having cheap goods from China or Asia is coming to at least a temporary halt, because, you're looking at, okay, I can buy something cheap, and the logistics is so expensive that the item's going to be expensive anyway. So, well, at that point, I just as well buy something of decent quality, and maybe I buy it somewhere else.
Yeah, I've got thoughts on that too. I'll share later. But Esther, what's your question?
Yes, actually, I heard the winner had got many advantages, such as the location good, shipping easily. But since the transportation system is still uncompleted, and there are still many disadvantages compared to the other countries, such as Malaysia, it also has the clam port. Why those small companies choose Vietnam rather than Malaysia? Maybe a better transportation system. I mean, the FDI also signed the contract with Malaysia, and China also got the relationship with Malaysia.
Yeah, I mean, right now it's I haven't really did a lot of business in Malaysia. So I and all the things that I've ever looked at Malaysia for, it really didn't work. I had one project that it was using some packaging, and I needed the cores, like the thing that they wrapped the tape around. And there were some companies in Malaysia that were doing that, and it was some specialty companies, and they were exporting a lot of that to Vietnam. But really, it's kind of, you know, if you're already in China, a lot of things, it's easy for your Chinese suppliers. So it's not always about, you know, where is your main supplier. It's also about where is the suppliers that you're using, your first tier, second tier suppliers. So if you're moving to Vietnam, it's very common to get a lot of supplies from China still. So it's easy for you to do that supply because China's right next door. As far as Malaysia, I mean, the biggest time that I've seen people really consider Malaysia is for like international purchasing centers, and I think, you know, I don't see a lot frequently about Malaysia being promoted as a service outsourcing center, but within purchasing, there's a lot of advantages of Malaysia because of the languages. So I can get Indians that speak Indian languages, I can get Chinese that speak Chinese languages, I can get other people that speak other Asian languages. So with, you know, if I'm a smaller company or I have a smaller group, I can have, you know, 3 people and cover a lot of countries and a lot of languages very easily, which, you know, here in Vietnam wouldn't be possible. In China probably wouldn't be possible. And in China, if it was possible, it would probably be extremely expensive. So, you know, there's some service things that I've looked at Malaysia for, but as far as manufacturing, I think most of my clients are really looking at deciding between Thailand and Vietnam. And Thailand is much more comfortable for Westerners and Western companies, but it's also expensive and a lot of things don't work. It depends on what industry you're in. Like automotive is much stronger in Thailand than it is in Vietnam. Vietnam is just starting off their automotive industry, and with their latest free trade agreements, I don't see how they're going to make it work. It just doesn't make sense to have a center for the Vietnamese market and develop those suppliers, because it just costs so much money. And there's Thailand next door, and you can get the parts from China or from Thailand duty free, and you know, you have a lot less issues.
Very good. Vicky, question.
Hi, yeah. I know that one of the big challenges that sourcing from Vietnam is probably the infrastructure. But other than the infrastructure, what are the major differences between sourcing from Vietnam and China? And also, how is the government policies towards the FDI? And what about the local people? Thank you.
You know, actually, for me, I rarely until now really worried much about the logistics, because the logistics is going to get done. I'm going to build something in a factory, or I'm going to deal with a supplier, and I'm going to put it in a container, and I'm going to ship it to Europe. I'm going to ship it to the US. It really is not a big deal. And I mean, if you have a product that's so complicated that you're going to have to get components from all over Vietnam and do that kind of shipping, then maybe you are better to just stick in China, where you can be in a cluster area and get everything locally easier. So the biggest thing, the difference between China and Vietnam is China is much bigger. China is much more mature. They're 20 years ahead of Vietnam. So because they're 20 years ahead of Vietnam, they have a lot more factories. The factories that they do have are much more mature. They have better processes. They have people that are better trained. You know, but you know, Vietnam is at the beginning of the cycle. and Vietnam is very eager to get into the market. The government is very, very supportive of people getting into the market. They've had a lot of missteps. That's kind of been one of the problems, that the government has the idea of how they're going to make things easy, and then they open up something or they try to do something, and then what happens is you find out that it doesn't quite work because they didn't understand. You know, I've had deals which, because of the way that the government opened up some contract, my client had a headquarters in Hong Kong, but because of the tax, they couldn't send the money from Hong Kong to Vietnam. So they had to set up a center, another company in Singapore, so they could do their investments in Vietnam. But it was because of there wasn't the maturity and there wasn't the thought behind how things work, and the tax problems that especially some American companies would have and some European companies would have. So there's always a lot of small problems that come up, and it will be fixed eventually. But you know, in the general, you're better just to go forward with it now.
Jacob, interesting point that, like, you know, if you're focusing on China, then Hong Kong is a great financial hub to go into China. Singapore seems to be geared towards, you know, setting up in Southeast Asia in terms of financing, bank networks, etc.
Yeah, I mean, that's been one of the things that I've seen the most recently is right now, a lot of companies that are set up in Hong Kong, and maybe officially they have their headquarters in Hong Kong, that's been moving on. Now, most large companies and some medium-sized companies have also set up another entity in Singapore. And that's why if you look at the investment in Vietnam, you'll find a lot of investment from Singapore. It's not really Singaporean companies, it's American companies, European companies, Australian companies, whatever, because the tax advantage of investing via Singapore is much better than investing via their own home country or investing via Hong Kong, where they manage their Hong Kong or their Chinese entity.
Maria.
Hello, sir.
Yes, welcome.
I read an article about an American company, Lovesac, moving out of China into Vietnam.
Oh.
And they said that they still get their second tier supplier for some of the material is still in China. So my question is, companies moving out of China to Vietnam, does that have an effect with their second and third tier suppliers? Would they get pushback from the Chinese government, for example?
I think that depends on how they do things. I mean, most companies are smart enough to do it in a very quiet way and not really say too much. I mean, that's why you're having so many companies set up an entity in Singapore. And what they do is when they have it, they sign a new contract, they just forget to sign it with the Hong Kong company and they sign it with the Singapore company. And then the business is quietly moved abroad. Lovesac, I actually did some business with them a long time ago. I didn't know they were moving out, and I thought that they were getting their foam in the US to do the packing. But there's some, because I know a lot of people, especially here in Vietnam, that do like foam beds. They have all localized everything in Vietnam. The only thing that a lot of them have some issues with, there's some the covers for the textile for the cover for the bed. There are not suppliers in Vietnam that can do that weaving, and this is a common thing within the textile industry. Vietnam will not allow to bring in the dyeing stuff into Vietnam because it's very dirty industry, very polluting industry. So basically, it either needs to come from China or from another country. You know, maybe Bangladesh, maybe India, a lot of India, especially cotton. Cotton's been quite a hot topic, especially with European countries and what's happening there, that a lot of companies have to prove the origin of their cotton to avoid issues. So there's a lot of push towards more Indian cotton in Vietnam, and it not to be Chinese cotton and not to be Chinese textile all the time, because it will require extra paperwork for the company that's involved with that.
Okay. Okay, Suresh.
Hi, Jacob. Probably a question for me was around if Vietnam was actually very successful in becoming Southeast Asia's global supply chain hub, would that be a big threat for China in the years to come? Similar to what we saw in Hong Kong, right? With protests and things like that, Singapore took it as an advantage, and you kind of see that decline in Hong Kong. Would that similar trend happen with China?
Well, I mean, this is a thing that people often get confused, and they think that Vietnam can replace China. Vietnam cannot replace China. Vietnam can replace China in certain industries, in certain categories, in certain areas only, because it's 1/15 the size. It's not going to be competing on everything at the same level. And then, of course, China has, a big head start in a lot of these industries. The thing that I think will happen is, especially as automation is much, much cheaper now, the automation will become more regional and the production becomes more regional. It's not that people won't produce in China and that China won't continue to have manufacturing. It's just that manufacturing is going to have a much smaller footprint, a much smaller production, and that smaller production will be basically more suited towards the Chinese market, and that's going to be what they're doing. And then, maybe the other production lines that they have, they'll move those to Vietnam or Thailand or Bangladesh or wherever, Mexico, Colombia. It really kind of depends. But the big thing that most companies are looking at is no one's looking at, if you're in a very specialty industry and maybe that industry is a good match, you can look at, okay, we're going to take everything that we have in China and we're going to move that to Vietnam. For some companies, especially medium-sized companies, it's a good idea. It's a good plan. But if you're a large multinational and you have a diverse things that you're producing, the idea that Vietnam is going to be your supplier is, probably not very true. One of the things that I actually did last year, not almost, but a very big chunk of my work last year was companies had moved to deal with Vietnam's suppliers. And these are large companies. They say, well, we have our suppliers in China, and now we have our supplier in Vietnam. Well, they thought that they weren't the same risk profile because they didn't think about the risk profile. But what they found out last year is we have these things and 50% of our components are coming from China. So then they panic because the goods aren't getting shipped from China. The goods can't come in. The factories aren't running in China. So then what they start looking at is they need, okay, how can we get these parts? Can we get them locally? Can we get them from another area? And then over this last year, especially the larger companies have spent a lot more time of looking at, if you're producing in Vietnam, are your suppliers actually local or diverse from your Chinese suppliers? So if all you're doing, like a lot of these factories in the north that are electronic suppliers, okay, all they're doing is bringing in a big container full of components, and then they bring them down into a factory and they basically have people assemble them by hand. It's manual work. It's not super skilled always. It's basically you're worried about the labor rates, but those factories cannot run without China. Eventually, the people will complain of like, well, I don't want to pay for the logistics. And then what they'll do to the Chinese factories is they'll say, hey, we need you to have a week's worth of supply here locally next to our factory. We don't want to order every night and have it shipped in and have a risk. And that's, from what I've seen, that's kind of happening, is they're basically telling their suppliers, we need more backup, we need more inventory. But the problem is right now there's very big shortage of warehousing space. So if you don't have a warehouse, where do you store it? And the factory also doesn't have room. Maybe if they aren't running at full capacity, they can use some of their factory to store the goods, but that's about it.
I guess the big question that summarizes what you're just talking about, Jacob, like going forward, is the big question is, how can we localize our second and third tier suppliers? Yeah. So let's who we have? Nasrat, your question.
Hi. So my question is, like, as you said earlier, that Vietnam could never be same as China. So what are the competitive advantage you think that Vietnam has over China? Yeah.
I personally think the biggest competitive advantage is China, that Vietnam is a young and growing market and a market that you can access. So when you're building something in Vietnam, you can actually sell it in Vietnam. When you're in China, that's not always the case. So, I mean, the first factory that I moved from the United States to China, I moved them there 20 years ago or something like this. And now they're in the process of returning to the US. And the main reason that they're returning to the US is because they moved to China thinking that they could sell in China. And after 15 plus years in China, they have realized that the government will only allow us to sell this one little product line, this one little niche, and that's it. So basically what the company's decided is, well, since most of our customers are in the US, and a lot of this now can be fully automated for a reasonable price. So they're going to leave the one small production line and their sales team and their marketing team for that production line in China, but the rest of it's going to go back to the US. And it's going to be automated, and it's going to be, you know, it's a very different system now that things can be automated at a reasonable price. So then now people can look at, instead of having one big factory, maybe you have 3 smaller factories. And this is much more what large multinationals are looking at, that they have production centers in different areas, and they have sometimes like redundancies of saying, well, if something happens with our Chinese factory, well, we have our factory in Malaysia, we have our factory in Brazil. Okay, we'll put them on overtime and they'll produce extra and they can cover that.
Excellent. Kritin, question.
Hi. So currently there is a huge shortage on microchip around the world, and Southeast Asia, Vietnam in particular, is a huge exporter of technological stuff. And ever since the COVID hit, the whole technological supply chain is in a mess right now. Do you think it will resolve itself anytime soon, or are we in it for the long run?
I thought before that it was going to resolve itself, but you know, with this newest wave and the newest wave and the newest wave and the Suez Canal being blocked and all these small problems that are happening, I think what's going to happen is things are going to go much more regional, much quicker than expected, which means you're going to produce for your local market. I mean, that's the reason right now why I'm working on projects now in Mexico, because I'm like, with the transportation, with all these issues right now, even though Mexico will be slightly more expensive, it makes more sense to be right there, have smaller shipments, have much more flexibility to not worry about getting your shipments into the US. Because if they're in Asia, you know, if the prices of logistics stay like the way they are right now, your prices are also not going to be competitive with Mexico. And you have no idea when things are going to be delivered, or you're going to have to hold a lot more inventory to be able to manage that, because you don't know what delays are going to happen. So I think that there's going to be a lot more regionalization. And actually, a lot of the advantage of Vietnam really is not for the United States. Really, most of the companies that I especially am talking to right now, what they're looking at is they're producing in Vietnam, but they're producing for Vietnam and Asia. They're not necessarily sending their products to the US. Yeah, so this is where they have a big advantage, because you know, companies that aren't worried about the shipping cost of shipping it to the US, then they don't worry about it so much. It's like, okay, if we need to ship something into China, we can ship it into China, we can ship it into Thailand, we can ship it into Cambodia, Malaysia, wherever. it's no big deal because it's in the local market and there's a local way to make it happen if it needs to happen. But you know, if you need to ship something to Europe or ship something to the US, it's much more difficult.
Just on that, Jacob, you mentioned like, I'm interested about how's business for you under the current lockdown. You're sort of doing business, locating clients, activities in Mexico on the other side of the world. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, basically, it's still some of the same clients that I dealt with. I mean,
Right.
the client that I'm working with in this project in Mexico, it's an American client that I worked with for quite a long time, and
Right.
off and on over the years. I've helped them on projects in China. I've helped them on projects in Vietnam, and but right now, what they're having issues with, it just doesn't seem possible. And I'm saying, well, it's a better opportunity to just suffer and do this in Mexico and make it happen locally, because if we do it here, we don't know what will happen. We don't know when logistics costs will go back.
Oh,
And
yes.
they can, and right now they can't predict their demand.
Absolutely.
And them not being able to predict their demand is a big thing. If you're dealing with a factory in Mexico and you're saying, okay, it takes 3 days to get delivered or 2 days to get delivered to me in the US, okay, it's not a big deal. It's not even a big deal to do small shipments. But if you're talking about Vietnam and, hey, we need 1 pallet extra, that's a big problem right now, because that means you're probably going to have to ship it by air, and your hope of making any profit is gone.
Lisa, question.
Yep, I think my question is more right, like if things goes to its normal way again, and then I realize also that Vietnam cost is getting higher and higher also every year, like higher cost and then higher administrative cost by the government, also unskilled labor. And then if you want to make a big factory, the government want to like hands-on with all your factory and all. So is it still worth it in a way to move your factory to Vietnam? And is there like any other country that can be an alternative, like a good alternative besides Vietnam to go into? Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's lots of alternatives. I mean, it really, the things that I look at is, what is the industry? Where's the customer? And that's the main thing that I look at. You know, like, you know, right now, as I'm working more doing these projects in Mexico, I'm thinking, okay, I have to focus more on clients that are in Australia, because in Australia, they don't have a Mexico. They don't have something right next door locally. And what they have right next door that's locally is kind of Vietnam. So it's an easy sell. Because when I'm talking to an American company, if they're producing for the Asia region, they have a huge advantage to produce here in Vietnam. But if they're producing in Vietnam and their plan is to ship, you know, 70% of their goods to the US and 30% to Europe, then it's a question of, is that really the best alternative? Because there's maybe your better alternative is to manufacture in Eastern Europe. Maybe your better advantage is to manufacture in Mexico. Maybe your advantage is to manufacture in Colombia. I mean, US really wants to help Colombia become a manufacturing center. They haven't had much luck at it, but they've been trying and helping them for a long time.
Wow. Audrey, you got your video on and your hand up, so we'll ask you.
I would like to ask that in the recent years, many Asian countries has been attracting a lot of more FDI, and particularly the ASEAN countries like Indonesia and Philippines. There have been many factories which have moved there, but I would like to know how does Vietnam manage to attract more FDI than Indonesia and Philippines, given that 3 of these countries are still developing countries?
Well, okay, for Philippines, I've had some not very good luck doing a lot of projects in Philippines. Philippines, I have not really had much luck trying to manufacture anything there. If it's a service business, it's very good. If I want to be a back office doing accounting, or if I want to be a back office doing engineering, detail design, or a customer support center or whatever, Philippines is great for a lot of that. for a lot of manufacturing, I just haven't had much luck. Indonesia, I spent a lot of time in Indonesia, and basically the problem that I had mostly in Indonesia was the transportation is a nightmare. I worked in a factory for 6 months, and my normal work would be I fly out every Monday, I fly back to China every Thursday or Friday. So basically I'm home for the weekend. In Indonesia, the transportation is so horrible that I couldn't even do that. So basically what I had to do is I had to fly to Indonesia on a Wednesday, and then I fly back the second Wednesday, because it was just too difficult. And this is, if I landed in the airport in Jakarta, if there was no traffic, it would be like an hour and a half to the factory. Under normal traffic, it would take me between 8 and 12 hours to get to the factory. And it's the same way coming back. And if you're trying to do business, it's a lot of this stuff is a nightmare. And then what I found out is a lot of the goods were coming from China anyway. It's just, you really have to look at what is the item you're doing in each region. Indonesia is very interesting because it's such a large population. They do have a decent amount of concentration of the population in Jakarta, which does help you cover that market. Basically the factory that I was working on, they'd been in Indonesia for 30, 40 years. And basically the only reason they were there is because they had access to a lake and they had access to water. And that was a big thing for this factory because it was a big chemical process and they needed a lot of water to cool down their system and do different things. So that water rights was a the only reason they were in Vietnam or in Indonesia. They actually, I helped them on projects. Also, they were considering building factories in Vietnam, but there's not enough water. So they decided not to go to Vietnam. So a lot of things depend on what is your inputs, what do you need to do in each factory, in each company, in each industry. So there is never just one answer. That's the hard part, and it's hard. As a student that doesn't have a lot of experience with a lot of different types of manufacturing. The easy one to look at is you look at world trade flows. Look at the World Trade Center or World Trade database, whatever.
Yeah.
WTO. You basically look at their database and look at what things are being exported from that country. And that's usually the easiest way. If you have really no idea, find out the HS code of what you're looking at, and then download the database and say, who are the main exporters of this thing? And if you find that there's an exporter of this, and then you can see that that's a decent place to look. But if you look at a lot of industries and a lot of different things, it doesn't seem very easy because China has been the easy thing for a lot of companies for the last 10 years, and a lot of people, they haven't done it the hard way in a long time. And since they haven't done it the hard way in a long time, it's very, very difficult to get them to do this. And it's very, it's the same thing that I have to deal with frequently for customers. I have to set their expectations that it's not going to be like China. I'm not going to just go to a factory. They have every certification you need. They're ready to go. They just need to know the final design and whatever. No, you're going to have to work with the factory. I can find factories that are capable. You might have to help them with equipment because maybe they don't have the equipment and maybe they don't have the ability to get some specialty equipment that you need. So
very interesting, Jacob. That WTO, that's a project that one group may want to work on. So I think we'll wrap this up. Michelle, you had a question, or did you just ask a question?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
So since Vietnam has the advantage of inexpensive labor, however, in long term, will wages be a lasting competitiveness? And does the government pay attention to the workers' welfare and the working environment they are in?
I think the Vietnam government does a lot better job of looking at the employee welfare. They definitely are better than in China in most circumstances. The cost of labor. The cost of labor is all relative. The cost of general workers here is quite cheap, but that's going to go up quite fast because it's a small country. If Vietnam tries to take too many different factories and too much assembly work from China, they're going to run out of population. And actually, this was what was happening in the last year or two, and especially in the last year. It wasn't the laborers. It wasn't people to do simple assembly work, something that I could train someone to do in a week. That's not a big deal. But what the big shortage has been recently has been like, I need a welder and a good welder and a specialty welder. And I need a machine operator, and I need a CNC operator, and I need someone that knows how to set up the machine correctly. And this is a big issue. And in China, there's a lot of these people that have been doing it for a long time, and that's why you have a lot of Chinese companies here in Vietnam. One of the most interesting things that I've seen actually is I really started looking at, I'd go to the trade fairs, and I always talk to the Chinese companies that were down here in Vietnam. And my question always was to them is, what are you producing in Vietnam? And a couple of years ago, they'd have one little product line, and everything else comes from China. And the last year, especially, because of all their customers require that everything is produced outside of China, now they can cover 80-90% of their production, and they can do it in Vietnam. And a lot of, especially larger companies, they want to go. I mean, I have many companies that basically, one of the things they ask me to do is go into the factory and verify that they can actually produce this. They have the equipment to do it, and do some kind of a verification that equipment runs and it is actually producing this equipment in Vietnam, because that's a big risk, especially to larger companies. Or a medium-sized company that's not so medium, approaching a large size company, there's a lot of risk to them, because there had been a number of companies that have gotten caught doing this, that they produce in China, ship into Vietnam, change some labels, change the packaging, and that's a big risk to a lot of companies. So that's something that, especially if you're in a high risk industry, aluminum extrusion, some clothing, you need to do some kind of a verification, and especially European companies need to do this. They need to do some due diligence to show that they have proven that this stuff is actually being produced in Vietnam. The equipment to produce it is in the factory in Vietnam, because if they don't do that and they get caught, it's a huge risk to them and their company.
Just another point of comparison, Jacob. I've done a few factory audits in Shenzhen, and it's so easy because you can visit 2-3 factories in a day and very quickly. How many can you visit in a day in Vietnam?
I think it depends on what you're doing.
I knew you were going to say that. Just either.
I mean,
yep.
In general, when I'm traveling and I'm doing like audits, generally I would do 2 factories a day, 3 factories a day. But the thing is, in China, some industries are so concentrated.
Yeah.
There's like eyeglass. There's a city in China that makes nothing but eyeglasses. If I want to visit 10 eyeglass factories a day, I can do it. In Vietnam, there are probably only 10 factories here, and they're pretty small. So, and they're probably a couple in the north, couple in the middle, couple in the south. So you're going to have a lot of travel between them, and they're just not the industry focus. And that's another thing.
When you actually verify, sorry, Jay, sorry to interrupt. When you're verifying the factories in Vietnam, and when you're working with the clients, do you always say to them, I want to do at least 2 or 3, or the client just say, look, I just want to do 1, and you just do the 1?
Well, for me, there's a lot of different balance. It's a lot about budget. It's a lot about what the industry is. It's a lot about how strategic that company is. if this is like a strategic partnership, my client might say, hey, okay, we don't have time to fly over and visit 10 factories, but we want you to go visit 10 factories, and we want you to tell us who are the 3 or 4 that you want us to visit with, because you think that they are good enough that we could have a partnership with. So a lot of things go down to how strategic the supplier is, what's the budget.
And you take a Vietnamese translator with you, Jacob, when you go out?
Yeah.
Okay.
If I do anything like that, I always bring a translator along, because I'll usually have a junior purchasing staff that will assist me on any of these projects.
Okay.
But
and you have a driver, or on your back of a motorbike?
Oh, you want to go on it. You want to go with a driver, because it is if you show up on a motorbike, they're not going to think you're a very professional company.
I understand it. I've always used
if your
drivers.
QC guy shows up on a motorbike, that's expected. But if you're thinking about visiting a company to do an audit to evaluate them, show up in a car.
Sorry, just some interesting operational questions there. Kate, you've had your hand up. Let's wrap this up. Kate, we'll take your question since your video's on. So good.
Okay, thank you, sir. So I actually wanted to ask about the textile industry. So you mentioned that it's concentrated in South Vietnam. So I was wondering, why would, for example, big fashion brands choose to source from South Vietnam rather than countries like Bangladesh, for example, which are also textile industry intensive? Yeah.
Oh no, actually the textile industry is leaving for Bangladesh, leaving for Ethiopia, leaving for other places. It really depends on what you're looking at. Right here, the stronger thing is if you need specialty fusing, you need some kind of like fancy Nike or fancy Under Armour or some brand that has like specialty fusing. They have some equipment that like will do a rubber zipper and fuse that together. This kind of specialty stuff. That kind of stuff is what Vietnam is much better at. But as far as like just a plain T-shirt or a plain thing, that's already gone basically. Unless you're doing small numbers and you don't really, maybe you're doing it because of you can do a production run of 300 items, and that's the reason you're doing it in Vietnam, because doing that in Bangladesh would be a nightmare. I mean, that's another thing. If you do it in Bangladesh, you need to do large production runs. Vietnam is not mature, but in the sporting textile in the shoe industry, Vietnam is extremely mature, and it's the higher end stuff that's here. I mean, a lot of the stuff has left China. It's now in Vietnam, but even like the lower end shoes have left Vietnam. And this is how things always go. And this is how things go, especially with lower end industries. If you want to see sometimes or somehow where things will flow, always watch the textile industry, because the textile industry is the most desperate for labor rates. So they need the lowest labor rate possible. So they will always go to the lower cost place. The big thing that I have with that is, in a lot of countries, this is a good way to develop a country. You get people in working in a textile factory, they do that, then they move up to a more complicated textile factory. Then in Vietnam, they're moving out of these textile factories and they're moving into electronic assembly factories. So that's a much higher, much better paid jobs. So they're moving up the production, up the value stream. And what I'm worried about more is as the automation stuff gets cheaper and cheaper, is will countries like Bangladesh, like Cambodia, like Ethiopia, will they have that opportunity, or will the automated production get to the point that it won't make sense and you can just do it with a robot and you can do it close to the final market? I don't remember if it was, I think it was Adidas, or maybe Nike, Converse, one of the big shoe brands. Basically, they were doing a mini factory that would basically 3D print the shoes locally. And their idea was to have a mini factory that you would go in, it was like basically 3 or 4 containers basically hooked together, and you'd go get your feet scanned, and they would basically print up your shoes and make your shoes for you right there in the factory in the US. So this kind of stuff in the next, it's not, it's no longer really 10 years away. It's much closer than people realize. I remember when I was in school 20 some years ago, and the 3D printers were really, really expensive and really basic. And now you can buy a 3D printer for 100, 200, 300 bucks. Those are not really great, but now you can also buy very good quality industrial 3D printers for, not so much money, for industrial standards at least.
Yeah, very, very good, Jacob. Like, I'm amazed. I've been making notes, guys and girls. Like, there's mine, as you can see, lots of notes here. My takeaway from what you're talking about tonight, Jacob, is trade agreement, big thing going for Vietnam. China 20 years ahead, and it has, because of that, it has turnkey solutions. So it is very attractive for that. So Vietnam needs more time, and you need to hold hands with the factories in Vietnam. COVID,
and that's my advantage, is that I've held the hands of factories for 20 some years.
That's why you're in business, Jacob, right?
So that's what I do.
Yes.
And usually the people that are managing the company in Europe or in US, they don't want to set in a factory and fix the problems day to day. They just, they'd rather just pay and, okay, tell me the progress every week.
That's cool. Container rates, the USA up to 15,000. Like, that's just crazy.
I've seen 20 and now out of China.
Oh no. Not for a 20, that's probably a 40-foot one, maybe.
40 foot, but a $20,000. So on a spot rate. And actually, as Christmas approaches, it probably is only going to get crazier.
Wow. Well, we hope to get someone in weeks to come talking about the logistics side. So it's going to be interesting. Malaysia, possible service outsourcing center, not necessarily manufacturing as a comparison with Vietnam. The infrastructure, big difference with China. Of course, the question about Lovesac was very, very interesting, because in response to that, Jacob talked about that the Vietnam is not allowing the importation of dyeing material, and if any cotton that does come in Vietnam coming from India, to minimize all that paperwork and documentation that's required with all the questions that's going on in the US and Europe over Xinjiang cotton. Automation, obviously, that's going to become more regional, where you try and have all the tiers together. Sourcing, manufacturing, and selling for regional, that's sort of a trend that you mentioned. And of course, more regionalization in the future. What industry? Where is the customer? They're the two big questions that decides your answer as to where to source from, etc. WTO, good idea. One group may want to look at that in terms of understanding the exports out of a country and skill set. Yes, it's great. There's lots of people in Vietnam. By the way, on average, the age in Vietnam of the workers, you took the population average age is just below 30 years old, compared to 37 for China, as an example. So keep that in mind. Hong Kong's getting old. That's closer to 45. But China's at 37, Vietnam's at 30. So that was the other point that Jacob was making. You got a younger population, both not only on the factory labor side, but also on the consumer side as well. There you go. I know some of you may have more questions, but we did promise Jacob just 1 hour, and he has gone over time. Jacob, you have been a real blessing to bring in lots of new energy to the class. Jacob, where can everyone contact you?
You can look for me on LinkedIn. That's about the easiest place to find me. I don't share a ton of information, but I'm there.
Okay, so you know where to connect with Jacob on LinkedIn. And yes, if you haven't done that by the end of tonight, then there's a message in your priorities as well. Okay, yeah. Jacob, thank you so much, and have a good evening, and thank you for joining us. Let's take a photo together. Let's do a screen capture. 1, 2, 3. Wait a minute. No, do another one. If I look at the camera, 1, 2, 3. Okay, I think we got that one. No, it didn't. One more. 1, 2, 3. Okay, there we got you. All right. Thank you so much, Jacob.
See you next time. Thanks.
All right.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks, Jacob.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Well, that was good. Let's have a break for a moment. Like I summarized a lot there. Of course, we could ask him a lot more questions, but we really got to the heart of, from many different angles, about where Vietnam is. And actually, you can make a whole course where we actually spend one country in every week, and then we do 10 countries. And wow, wouldn't that be an interesting course to take in Master of International Business? Yes. So there's an example of what we could do with just one country, and we could do the same for Malaysia, for Indonesia, for Cambodia, and go for the whole semester. All right. Lots of interesting issues there. How about we take a break, and then I'll introduce what we're doing for tonight. And we've got an action-packed night. We have just, in the last 2 weeks and the first half of tonight, we were very macro. We're looking at the country level. Where do we source? Which country do we choose? And what are the problems of different countries? For the rest of tonight, we're actually going to go down to micro. So I just want you to prepare for that. When you come back in, we're going to be looking at a supplier from the micro point of view. What does a factory look like? And that will actually be a theme for the coming weeks. And it's an insight that very few global supply chain units around the world give. And that's something special I want to bring to this class. So I'll see you in 6 or 7 minutes. Thank you very much.
Dr. Neil, when do we, by the way, have a minute to discuss the group project, the field research, or the desk research actually now topic? Is it better to do over email or over Zoom after class?
There are 3 parts to tonight. That will be in the 3rd part of tonight. We're going to, 2 things. If there are generic questions about what you have to do and things like that, we can discuss in the 3rd part tonight. If there's specific questions about a particular topic you want to follow as a group, then what we do, we set up a Zoom session as a group, and then we go through it one by one by one by one. So we want to hit every nail on its head to make sure that you do a great job on your project.
Yep. Okay.
And I expect to meet with every group. Like this is, I expect that, Oliver. So
yeah, it's always good to streamline right beforehand.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. We got a 5-minute break.
Absolutely.
Okay. 5 minutes. Okay. Thanks.
Hi, Benjamin. Thanks for dropping back in. Hi, Benjamin.
Hey. Hi. It took me a while to get the password for this call, so I was a little bit late, but I got it done. So
you made it. You made it.
Yeah.
You got your arms, you got your legs, and you got your head. Then what else can we ask for? And your personality. So I think that's great.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
And
no worries.
You're in Malaysia, Benjamin.
Yeah, correct.
All right. Well, let's make sure we get you up to speed and plugged in and everything. Okay.
Sure. Easy. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Good.